My name is Emily. I'm 29 years old and I work as a marketing manager in Chicago. On paper, I've built a life I'm proud of, a good career, independence and stability. But none of that seemed to matter the night I sat across from my family at dinner. My sister Madison raised her glass, showing off her brand new engagement ring, and everyone clapped. Then she looked straight at me and smirked. "If your life is really that amazing, Emily, why are you still fat?" The room fell silent. I laughed awkwardly, waiting for someone to defend me, but instead my parents joined in. My mother leaned forward and said coldly, "When your sister's wedding comes, maybe you should just watch it on the live stream. We can't risk you embarrassing her." I felt the words hit me like a slap. I had spent my whole life sacrificing for this family, even giving thousands of dollars to help pay for that very wedding, and yet, in that moment, they made me feel like I didn't even belong at the table. Something broke inside me that night, but what they didn't expect was that their cruelty would light a fire in me, one that would change everything. And when I finally showed up again months later, I was not the sister they remembered. For as long as I can remember, I have always felt like an outsider in my own family. That thought has never really left me, and when I try to explain it, I always go back to the earliest memories of my childhood. I was the bigger child, the one who took up more space in a line at school, the one who could not blend in no matter how much I wanted to. Other kids noticed it right away. At recess, they called me names that I still hear in my head if I am quiet for too long. They thought it was funny to point and laugh when I ran slowly or when I avoided sports. And the hardest part was not only hearing those names from classmates, but realizing that even my own sister Madison sometimes joined in. She was only a year younger, and in those moments when she laughed with the other kids, it felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than anything the strangers could say. I remember one birthday very clearly. I had turned 10 and Madison had just turned 9 the month before. When the gifts were handed out, Madison tore the wrapping from a brand new bicycle. It was bright red, shining in the light, and everyone clapped and cheered. I was given a book with a torn cover that had clearly been passed down. My parents smiled and said, "You love reading, don't you? This suits you better than toys." I tried to smile too, but inside, I felt invisible. Madison was celebrated while I was quietly told to be content with less. That day, I realized how often joy in our home belonged to her, not to me. As the years went by, a pattern formed. I gave up the last slice of cake because Madison wanted it. I handed over my allowance because Mum and Dad said the bills were tight. Later, in high school, when I worked part-time at a small store, I brought home most of my paycheck and placed it on the kitchen counter without being asked. Some weeks that money went toward groceries. Other weeks it went to pay for Madison's extracurricular activities. There was never a thank you. It was expected as if that was simply my role in the family. I was the one who provided quietly in the background. I can still remember the feeling of standing in the kitchen late at night after a shift, my feet sore handing over my crumpled bills. My parents would take them with a smile, not maliciously, but as if it were natural. Madison would grin and run off to her practice or her club. I would be left behind with the faint satisfaction that I had helped, mixed with the deeper ache that no one seemed to see me at all. Looking back now as an adult, I can see how these small moments shaped me. Affection in my house was not something that flowed freely. It was not given for who you were. It was earned when you met the expectations placed on you. For me, that meant keeping my grades high, staying quiet, and making sacrifices. For Madison, affection seemed to come without effort. She was the lively one, the charming one, the one who drew people in. My parents laughed more with her. They lit up when she walked into a room. I learned early on to step aside and let her shine, and I told myself that was what good sisters did. Still inside, I longed for even a fraction of that light. At night, I would escape into books because books did not laugh at me or demand more from me. They did not weigh me down with guilt or disappointment. They offered me a world where my sighs and my silence did not matter. But each time I closed the cover and stepped back into my real life, the same truth greeted me. I was the daughter who gave, and Madison was the daughter who received. I was the one in the shadows. Even now, when I recall those forgotten years, what I feel most is loneliness. Not the kind you cure with friends or distractions, but the heavy kind that comes when you live among people who should love you most and yet never truly see you. That loneliness stayed with me as I grew older, and it became the lens through which I saw myself. I believed for a long time that love was a luxury I did not deserve, that it was something reserved for others, but not for me. And that belief shaped every choice I made in the years that followed. I carried it with me into middle school, where the comparisons between me and my sister Madison only grew sharper. At school, my grades came easily. I enjoyed reading and studying, and I worked hard. Teachers often praised me, and my parents repeated those words at home. But every compliment given to me was like a shadow that fell on Madison. She struggled with her classes, and the gap between us widened. At the dinner table, my parents would shake their heads at her report card and then point to mine. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" they would say. I remember sitting there with my fork in my hand, staring at the food on my plate, feeling a knot in my stomach. I had done nothing wrong, yet in that moment my success was turned into a weapon against her. I wanted to disappear, to take back my good grades if it meant she would not glare at me the way she did. That glare was only the beginning. One evening in middle school, I stayed up late, finishing a project that counted for a large part of my grade. I laid it neatly on my desk before bed, proud of how much time I had spent on it. The next morning, the papers were gone. I searched everywhere, panic rising in my chest. Finally, I saw them crumpled and scribbled over in the corner. Madison was leaning against the doorframe, with a sly smile. She said she thought it was funny, that I should lighten up. My throat burned, but I did not tell our parents. Something inside me already knew they would not take it seriously. They never did. In high school, the cruelty became sharper. One afternoon, I walked past Madison's room and heard her laughing with her boyfriend. I paused when I heard my name. She said, "My sister is just like a maid. She cleans, helps studies, but that's all she's good for." The sound of their laughter floated out into the hallway, and I stood frozen, my hands trembling. I slipped back into my room quietly, trying to breathe. The words stayed with me like a heavy stone. I had never thought of myself that way, but hearing it from her lips made me wonder if that was how everyone in my family saw me. A helper, useful but not truly loved. There was one evening when I tried to share with my parents how much it hurt. I told them Madison ruined my schoolwork, that she called me names. My mother waved her hand and said, "That's just how siblings bond." My father added, "You're the older one, be patient." They both smiled as if it was nothing. I sat there in silence, my chest tight, realizing that my pain did not even make a dent in their view of us. They would never hold her accountable. They saw her jokes as harmless, my complaints as oversensitive. I began to accept that nothing would change. Inside, I still hoped she cared about me, that her teasing was just immaturity, that maybe one day we would be close. But each time she destroyed my work or threw another cruel word my way, that hope dimmed a little more. I told myself I was her ally, her protector, the older sister who should be patient. But deep down, I knew she did not see me that way. To her, I was not a friend. I was a rival she could not defeat at school, so she tried to chip away at me in every other way she could. Looking back, I realized that was the moment a seed was planted, not in her heart, but in mine. A seed of doubt, the growing awareness that the bond I thought we shared was never equal. For me, she was family. I would have defended without hesitation. For her, I was an obstacle, someone to outshine or tear down. That realization changed how I looked at everything that followed, and as I grew older, it shaped the way I carried myself into adulthood. I poured myself into school, and by the time I reached college, I was determined to prove that I was worth something. I studied hard, I pushed myself, and I graduated with honours. Later, I found a stable job as a marketing manager, the kind of position that gave me financial independence and a sense of direction. On paper, my life looked solid, and in many ways, it was. I paid my bills, I created a home for myself, and I learned how to manage on my own. But even in those years of achievement, I could feel the old patterns from my family clinging to me. My parents noticed my success, but not in the way I needed. They spoke about me often, but always as if I were a trophy they could display to others. At family dinners, they would smile at relatives and say, "Emily's doing so well, she got another promotion, she's moving up so quickly." Their voices carried pride, but it was pride directed outward. It was about how good they looked as parents, not about me as a daughter. When I sat across from them hoping for a simple word of warmth, I rarely received it. Their praise was for show, not for me. Over time, I began to pull away. At first, I skipped gatherings because I was busy with work or classes, but as the years went on, I realised that even when I sat at the same table, I was never really seen. My presence was an afterthought, my voice easy to talk over. Slowly, I stopped going. I told myself I had other priorities, and in truth, I did. But underneath the real reason was that it hurt to sit in a room where I felt invisible. As the invitations kept coming and I kept declining, something else began to happen. My absence left a blank space. Relatives stopped asking about me, and with time they seemed to forget I was part of the picture at all. That blank space gave Madison room to tell her own version of me. She was there, smiling, making small jokes, weaving little stories while I was not around to correct them. I can see now how easily she shaped their view of who I was, and how quickly people accepted her words as truth. In my own life, away from those gatherings, I was building independence. I rented a small apartment in the city and decorated it with quiet comforts things I chose for myself. I woke up early, made coffee in a kitchen that was finally mine, and left for work knowing I could take care of myself. At night, I sometimes sat in silence, feeling proud that I had created a life without needing anyone's help. Yet even in those private moments, I felt something missing. I had built a structure that was strong, but inside there was still a hollow space. I longed for recognition, not the kind that came in front of neighbours or relatives, but the kind that came in private when a parent looked you in the eye and said, "I see you. I am proud of you." That never came. I tried to tell myself it did not matter, that I had enough, that I could be satisfied with independence alone. But the emptiness followed me like a shadow that stretched behind every accomplishment. No matter how high I climbed, I could not shake the sense that I was still the same girl, waiting for her parents to notice her. I realise now that success cannot fill the places where love is missing. I had worked so hard to build a life that looked full, but inside I was still carrying the weight of being overlooked. I had grown, I had changed, but in my family story, I was still in the background fading from view while Madison took centre stage. And I knew, even then, that this silence around me was setting the stage for something worse to come. That moment arrived the night I returned home for dinner, believing for a brief second that maybe things had changed, that maybe time had softened the edges of my family's words. I drove up the old street and pulled into the driveway, my heart caught somewhere between dread and hope. When I stepped inside, the house looked the same, warm lights glowing the table set, the familiar smell of my mother's cooking. She greeted me with a small smile, almost polite, and for a moment I wanted to believe it was a good sign. My father asked about my drive, and Madison was already seated, her phone in her hand, tapping quickly, before she looked up with that same confident grin she had always worn. We sat down together, and for a while it almost felt normal. We passed the dishes, shared small talk, and I thought to myself, maybe this time will be different. Then Madison cleared her throat, set her phone aside, and raised her left hand. A ring sparkled under the light, and she announced she was engaged. The room erupted. My parents clapped, their eyes lit up with joy, and Madison basked in their excitement. I smiled, too genuinely happy that she had found someone, but even in that moment of sincerity, I felt the shift. Every face turned toward her, every word revolved around her, and just like that, I was invisible again. As the congratulations settled, Madison turned her gaze to me. There was a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth as she leaned back and said, If your life is really that good, why are you still fat? The words landed hard, sharper than she knew, or maybe exactly as sharp as she intended. My chest tightened and the room grew quiet, the kind of silence that waits to see if you will laugh along or break down. I tried to smile weakly to brush it off, but my parents quickly joined in. They said they were worried about me, that I was nearly 30 with no husband, no children, that my career would not keep me warm at night. They said it was time I thought seriously about settling down before it was too late. I sat there, my fork heavy in my hand, listening as my work and my independence, all the pieces of my life I had built for myself, were stripped down to nothing in their eyes because I had not checked the boxes they wanted. My face burned as they spoke, and I fought back the urge to defend myself, because I knew they were not listening. Then, my mother leaned in closer. Her voice was calm, almost kind on the surface, but every word carried a blade. "If you do not feel comfortable, you can just stay home," she said. "We will send you the live stream. Just do not embarrass your sister on her big day." The sentence hit harder than all the others. It told me without question that I did not belong. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, not even as a guest. They could celebrate without me, and in their minds the solution was simple: keep me out of the picture. I sat frozen in my chair, my throat tight, my hands trembling under the table. I could not bring myself to answer. I looked down at my plate at the food that suddenly tasted like nothing at all, and I wondered how it was possible that the people who were supposed to know me best could treat me like a stranger. I swallowed hard, forcing the ache back into the quiet corners of myself, where I had always hidden it. That night, surrounded by the people who should have lifted me up, I felt smaller than I ever had before. I drove home in silence, my hands tight on the wheel, my chest heavy with the words that had been thrown at me. When I walked into my apartment, I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet. I placed my bag on the chair, sat at the edge of my bed, and tried to swallow the pain as if pushing it deeper would make it disappear. But it did not disappear. Their voices kept circling in my head. "We will send you the live stream. Do not embarrass your sister. You will never get married." The words pressed on me until it was hard to breathe. I thought back to everything I had already given, the sacrifices I had made, the ways I had tried to show I cared. I remembered writing that check for $30,000 money I had saved, carefully handing it over to help pay for Madison's wedding flowers and the venue deposit. I had done it quietly, expecting nothing more than a thank you, hoping it would prove that even if I was different, I was still part of this family. Yet at that dinner table, they never mentioned it once. It was as if it did not matter, as if I did not matter. They were willing to take my support, but not willing to see me. The more I thought about it, the sharper the ache grew. I picked up my phone and saw the screen lit with notifications. 20 missed calls blinked back at me, and beneath them, messages stacked one after another. My parents, Madison, sometimes both of them, in the same minute. Not one message asked how I was or if I was hurt. Every word was blame. "You overreacted. You ruined dinner. You always make things harder than they need to be. Stop acting like a child." Reading them, my hands shook. I felt as though I had stepped into a twisted play where no matter what I did, I was always the villain. They mocked me to my face. They erased my sacrifices, and when I tried to protect myself by staying quiet, they called me selfish. The walls of my apartment closed in around me as each vibration of the phone added to the weight pressing on my chest. Finally, I set it face down and let it buzz against the table while I buried my face in my hands. For the first time in a long while, I allowed the tears to come. Years of swallowed pain, of silent endurance, of waiting to be seen spilled out. I cried for the little girl who gave away the last piece of cake, for the teenager who worked late shifts and handed her paycheck to parents who barely said thank you, for the young woman who paid thousands of dollars to help her sister's wedding, only to be told she should stay home and watch on a screen. I cried because I realized the truth I had been avoiding. No matter what I gave, it would never be enough. not enough to earn their love, not enough to deserve their respect, not enough to be welcomed without condition. I lay back on my bed staring at the ceiling, my body shaking with the release of all I had carried, and somewhere inside that flood of sorrow, a quieter thought began to form. Silence was not protecting me anymore. It was destroying me. Each time I stayed quiet, each time I let them use me, each time I swallowed my words, I was losing pieces of myself. That week, the wounds of my past were torn wide open. But in that raw and painful space, something else began to stir. A need to change, a need to stop living for their approval, a need to finally claim myself before there was nothing left of me. It was not just about a body, it was about finally stepping into a life where I was enough. That thought stayed with me through the tears, through the silence, and into the next morning when I decided I could not keep living the way I had been. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at my phone. My parents' messages were still there, accusing and sharp, but for once I ignored them. Instead, I opened a search bar and typed in something I had avoided my whole life: personal trainers near me. At first, I laughed at myself, certain I would never follow through, but one name caught my eye, a woman named Sarah, whose story I read through quickly. She had once been overweight, she had once hated herself the way I hated myself, and she had rebuilt her life. Something in that gave me a sliver of hope. My hands trembled as I filled out the form, almost expecting myself to close the window at the last second. Instead, I pressed submit and set the phone down, my heart racing. When Sarah called me back later that afternoon, her voice was warm, steady, and calm. She said she understood how hard the first step was, and she told me I had already done the hardest part by reaching out. We scheduled a first session, and even after I hung up, I sat in shock. For the first time, I felt like maybe I was not completely stuck. That first day at the gym was almost unbearable. The walls seemed too bright, the mirrors too harsh, and every machine looked like a test I would fail. My heart pounded before I even began, and I wanted to run out the door. Sarah stood by me, gentle but firm, guiding me through each movement, reminding me I did not have to be perfect, only willing. That night I came home and wrote in my journal. I hated the gym today, but I remembered Mum's words, "No one will ever love you." Now I'm doing this for myself. Seeing those words on the page was like drawing a line in the sand. For years, I had believed that if I changed, it had to be for them to earn their love. But in that moment, I began to realize the change had to be mine. The first few weeks were filled with soreness and self-doubt. I stumbled through exercises, I struggled to catch my breath, and sometimes I left in tears. But Sarah kept reminding me to give myself grace. She said, "You do not have to undo years of pain in one night. You only have to show up again tomorrow." Slowly, something shifted. My body started to feel stronger. I could lift a little more, run a little longer, breathe a little easier. My clothes began to fit differently, and for the first time, I looked in the mirror and saw not just what was wrong, but what was changing. Alongside the physical changes came something deeper. I stopped hearing my mother's cold words every time I looked at myself. I stopped believing Madison's laughter was the final truth about who I was. Instead, I began to hear my own voice, the one that whispered, "Keep going, you are worth this." I bought a new shirt, something I never would have dared wear before, and I walked into work feeling like I could finally take up space without apology. I cut my hair into a style I had always been too afraid to try, and when I looked at my reflection, I did not see a stranger. I saw someone I was beginning to recognize as myself. There were still hard days. There were still mornings when I wanted to give up. But each time I returned to that journal, I reminded myself why I had started. I was not losing weight to fit into their idea of love. I was building a life where I could love myself. Sarah noticed the difference in me before I did. She said one day, "You carry yourself differently now. You walk in like you belong here." And for the first time in my life, I believed her. The gym was no longer a punishment. It became a place where I proved to myself again and again that I could change, that I could endure, and that I could grow stronger in ways that went far beyond muscle. As the months passed, I realised I was no longer the woman who had sat in silence at that dinner table, swallowing every cruel word. I was not the girl who handed over money or time only to be forgotten. I was someone new, someone who had chosen herself, and that choice had changed everything. It was not an overnight transformation, and I was not suddenly free of all the pain, but I had crossed a line. I had taken control, and I was not going back. I could see now that this was only the beginning, but it was enough to know that the turning point had come and I had stepped into it fully. For weeks, I carried that strength with me. And for the first time, I felt as though my life was moving in the right direction. But as I grew more confident, I began to notice something unsettling whenever I spoke to my family. Their words were polite, their smiles practiced, yet something in their tone told me I was being managed rather than welcomed. It started with my mother. During one of the wedding planning sessions, I overheard her speaking to the photographer. Her voice was low but firm as she said, "Make sure Emily stands behind Madison in the pictures. Madison should be the star." I froze for a second, unsure if I had heard correctly. I told myself maybe I misinterpreted it, but the tightness in my chest said otherwise. Later that same week, my father stopped by my apartment with a garment bag in his hands. He handed it to me with a strange look on his face. Here he said, "This is what you should wear for the wedding. It will avoid trouble. We do not want any distractions." When I unzipped the bag, I saw a dull, shapeless gown in a colour that did nothing for me. It looked like something chosen to blend into the background rather than be part of the celebration. I stood there holding it, trying to process the meaning. My father avoided my eyes, almost as though he knew I would not question him directly. A part of me wanted to believe it was just poor taste, but another part whispered that this was intentional. A few days later, Madison sent me a message about the dress code. She wrote, "Casual garden style, nothing too formal." It sounded odd, given the venue, but I told myself not to overthink it. She was the bride, and if she wanted it relaxed, I could respect that. Still, something felt off. I did not realise then that the actual event would be black tie, and that by following her directions, I would stand out in the worst possible way. Looking back, I see how carefully it was planned, but at the time, I only felt a vague unease. I wanted so much to believe my family wanted me there, yet every small sign suggested the opposite. That unease sharpened one evening when I saw Madison whispering to her friend Olivia at a gathering. I did not hear everything, but I caught enough. Madison said, "If my sister looks better than me, no one will look at me on my wedding day." Her tone was sharp, defensive, and filled with a bitterness that made Olivia's smile falter. Olivia gave her a look I could not quite read, but Madison only shrugged it off as if she had said nothing unusual. I stood nearby, pretending not to notice my heart beating faster. The words echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. It was clear that no matter how much I tried to stay in the background, my very existence threatened her. As the wedding drew closer, the tension grew heavier. My parents spoke to me kindly enough on the surface, but their eyes lingered in ways that made me uneasy. They would glance at each other after I walked into a room, as if sharing a silent thought I was not meant to know. Madison's comments carried their usual bite, but there was something sharper underneath now, as though she was preparing for a performance where I was not welcome. I could not put my finger on the details, but the feeling was undeniable. I had changed, and that change frightened them. Instead of celebrating it, they were preparing to bury it. One night, lying awake in my apartment, I thought about all of it. The strange look on my father's face when he handed me the dress. My mother's quiet instructions to the photographer. Madison's whispered confession to Olivia. Piece by piece, it painted a picture I did not want to see. I was not being invited into the celebration. I was being carefully placed in the shadows again, hidden where I would not distract from Madison's spotlight. Still, even as those suspicions grew, I tried to push them aside. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being too sensitive, that maybe they really did want me there after all. But deep down I knew. I knew their smiles were too controlled, their words too carefully chosen, and their gestures too familiar. I had lived with those signals my whole life, and they always meant the same thing. They were making plans, and I was at the centre of them, not as family, but as someone they needed to manage. I tried to hold on to the hope that I was wrong, but in my heart I understood the truth. Their schemes were already in motion, and I was walking straight into them. The day of the wedding arrived, and I told myself I would go with dignity. I wanted to believe that no matter what had happened before, I could still stand in that room as a sister, as a daughter, as part of the family. I chose my outfit carefully, following the instructions Madison had given me, a soft garden-style dress, simple and graceful. When I walked into the banquet hall, though the air shifted, eyes followed me as I made my way inside, whispers fluttered from table to table, and I felt the heat of curiosity pressing down on me. At first, I told myself it was because no one had seen me in so long, but soon the reason became clear. A cousin leaned close with a grin that carried more pity than kindness and said, "We heard from Madison you had work done. You must have had surgery, right? No one changes that fast." I froze. I wanted to deny it, to shout the truth, but all I could do was swallow hard and force a smile that did not reach my eyes. My heart pounded. Madison had not only tried to control my image at the wedding, she had gone further. She had spread lies that my transformation was fake. Before I had time to recover, another relative approached, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "We never knew you were so hard on Madison growing up," she said. "She told us you bullied her, that you made her life miserable." I stared at her, my mouth open, no words forming. Memories rushed back of being teased, mocked, tripped in hallways, locked out of my own room. I remembered Madison and her friends laughing at me while I hid behind my books. And now she had twisted it, all painting herself as the victim and me as the cruel one. My chest burned not only with anger, but with grief. It was as if the years of silence had been rewritten, the truth erased and replaced with her lies. I tried to steady my breathing, but the ground beneath me felt unsteady. Then came the final blow. The photographer called the family together for a group picture. I moved toward the others, hoping to take my place, but when I looked up, I saw the arrangement. Madison at the centre, my parents glowing beside her and me, directed to stand at the back, half hidden behind her new husband. The memory of hearing my mother's voice telling the photographer to keep me behind her sister came rushing back. It was not my imagination. It was real. They had planned to erase me even from the photographs, to hide me away, as if my existence itself was an embarrassment. My throat tightened, and for a moment I almost obeyed. I almost stepped into that corner, ready to let the camera capture me half concealed, another piece of evidence that I was meant to stay invisible. But something inside me snapped. I saw Madison smirking at me, her lips curled in triumph, my parents nodding in quiet approval, the relatives waiting to see if I would take the place they had chosen for me. My pulse raced. My palms were damp, but I knew if I gave in this time, I would be erased forever. I took a breath, and before I could lose my courage, I stepped forward. I walked out of the back row and placed myself right beside Madison, in full view of everyone, the light catching me as if the space had been mine all along. The room went still. My voice was steady when I spoke, carrying across the hall. "You pushed me out of the picture years ago. Today, I step back in." For a moment, no one moved. My words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Madison's smirk disappeared, her eyes wide with shock. My mother's face hardened. My father shifted uneasily, and the photographer froze, unsure of what to do. The relatives stared, some with surprise, some with something close to admiration, as though they had just seen me for the very first time. I did not flinch. I stood tall, my chin lifted, my shoulders square. For once, I did not shrink. I did not apologize. I did not step aside. I owned my place, and in that silence, I felt something I had been searching for all my life. I felt free. The camera clicked, capturing the moment, and I knew this picture would not erase me. Not this time. Inside me, anger and relief collided. I had broken the pattern. I had said the words I needed to say, not just for them, but for myself. I smiled, then calm and certain, letting them see that no scheme, no lie, no cruel whisper could undo what I had claimed. I was here, and I was not leaving the frame again. The flash of the camera still echoed in my mind when I felt the weight of the room pressing on me. Conversations picked up again, the clinking of glasses filled the silence. But I knew eyes were still on me. I sat at the edge of my seat, my heart pounding, and something inside me whispered that if I stopped here, it would not be enough. I had taken back my place in the picture, but I needed to take back my voice too. The MC called for toasts, inviting family members to speak. My father shifted in his chair, ready to stand, but I felt my body move before I could think. I rose, walked toward the microphone, and placed my hand around it. The room fell quiet. I could feel every gaze following me, the surprise on their faces, the tension in the air. For a moment I thought my voice would fail, but then the words came steady and clear. All my life I said I was called a shadow. I was told to step back, to stay behind, to make space for others. I was made to feel invisible, like my only worth was in what I could give or what I could hide. My eyes moved across the tables, meeting stares that darted away quickly. But I am not a shadow. Not anymore. My voice grew stronger as I went on. If I have changed, it is not because I wanted to impress you. It is not because I thought I had to be thinner to deserve love. It is not because anyone here finally decided I was worth something. I changed because I chose me. I did it for myself, and only for myself. There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to make your heart race, but I stood calm. Madison sat frozen in her seat, her jaw tight, her eyes blazing with disbelief. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clutching her wine glass. My father glanced down at the tablecloth, unable to look at me. They were powerless to stop me. Around the room, relatives, shifted whispers rising. Some nodded slowly, others stared wide-eyed, but all of them were listening. I raised my glass, then lifting it high enough for everyone to see. Tonight, I said I celebrate not a role you gave me, not the version of me you tried to shape, not the shadow you tried to keep in the background. I celebrate the woman I have become, and that I do not need anyone's permission for. The hall was silent again. My hand did not shake as I tipped the glass to my lips and drank the taste sharp and freeing. When I set the glass down, I felt a rush of something I had never known before. It was not approval. It was not applause. It was liberation. I stepped back from the microphone, placed it gently on the stand, and turned to walk away. I did not look at Madison. I did not glance at my parents. I left them in their silence, left them to sit with their anger and their shame. My steps were steady, and with each one I felt lighter, as if the chains I had carried for years were breaking apart. I knew whispers would follow me, that later they would call me disrespectful, ungrateful, maybe even cruel. But none of that mattered anymore. I had not spoken for them. I had spoken for me. As I returned to my seat, I lifted my head and allowed myself a small smile. For the first time in my life, I was not waiting for anyone else to tell me who I was. I had claimed it with my own words in front of every person who had ever doubted me. And no matter what they said after tonight, nothing could erase that. I sat at my table, the noise of the banquet rising around me again, but the weight of the moment still clung to me. My heart was calmer now, steadier, as if speaking out had cleared a fog I had been living in for years. My parents whispered to each other at the head table. Madison fumed beside her new husband, and relatives kept stealing glances at me, some curious, some stunned, some even approving. But I did not look at them for answers anymore. I took a slow sip from my glass, letting myself breathe in the quiet victory. That was when I noticed Olivia moving toward me. She hesitated, halfway, glanced back at Madison as if to check whether she was watching, then finally came and sat across from me. Olivia had always been around one of Madison's closest friends, the kind who knew our family's habits, who had spent countless afternoons in our living room. I expected her to take Madison's side to scold me for making a scene, but when she leaned closer, her voice was softer than I imagined. She asked, "If your sister apologizes, will you forgive her?" The words hung between us, simple but heavy, and for a moment I did not answer. I stared at her, searching her face for the reason she asked. Was she trying to defend Madison, or was she honestly curious? She held my gaze, patient, waiting. I thought back to all the years when I wanted nothing more than that word from Madison, sorry. I remembered the night she barged into my room with her friends laughing, at my body calling me names until I wanted to disappear. I remembered the mornings when my homework was gone, my carefully written papers taken by her just so I would stumble. I remembered standing in the school hallway, watching her trip me with a tray in my hands, the laughter ringing in my ears, and how I had turned to my parents for help, only to hear them say, "That's just how siblings bond. Be patient, she's only playing." I remembered believing them, trying to convince myself that maybe it was harmless, as maybe it was love in disguise. And yet, every time I thought about it now, all I felt was the deep, hollow ache of betrayal. I thought about that dinner weeks ago when my mother suggested I should stay home and watch the wedding on a screen, as if my presence itself was an embarrassment. I thought about the lies Madison had spread just hours earlier, telling relatives I had bullied her, claiming I had gone under the knife to change my body. And I thought about how my father had handed me that dull, shapeless dress, with his eyes averted as though I should already know I did not deserve to be seen. All those memories crowded me as Olivia's question lingered. I took a breath and finally said, "An apology repeated with the same mistakes isn't an apology. It's just a pause before the cruelty begins again. I don't need that anymore." Olivia blinked, her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I went on because once I started, I couldn't stop. I spent years waiting for them to notice me, to realise how much I had given, how much I had endured. I thought if they said they were sorry, if they admitted they were wrong, I would finally feel better. But now I know the truth. I don't need their sorry. My healing doesn't belong in their hands. It belongs in mine. Olivia lowered her eyes, then looked back up at me, with something almost like respect. She said quietly, "I think you're stronger than anyone here expected." For a second, her words caught me off guard. Strong. It wasn't a word I had heard directed at me before, not from my family. But sitting there, I realised she was right. I had been strong to survive years of silence. I had been strong to stand up in that picture. And I was strong now to say out loud that forgiveness was not a gift I owed to people who kept breaking me. Forgiveness, I told her, isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about letting go of the grip their actions had on me. I don't carry their mistakes anymore. That burden is theirs, not mine. Olivia nodded slowly, her eyes distant, as though she was thinking not only about me but about her own life. Maybe she had seen sides of Madison that troubled her. Maybe she was realising truths she had ignored. She did not argue, and for that, I was grateful. She simply let the word stand. I leaned back in my chair, the noise of the banquet swelling again, but inside me there was a calm I had never felt before. For years I believed healing would come from them, admitting what they did. But the power was never theirs. It was mine all along, and now I had claimed it. Olivia touched my arm gently before standing. "Whatever happens," she said, "you've changed something tonight." Then she walked away, leaving me alone but not lonely. I sat with her question still echoing but the answer clear in my heart. I no longer needed apologies dressed in empty words. I no longer needed permission to feel whole. Forgiveness for me meant stepping forward without waiting for anyone else to catch up. It meant living free, unburdened by the shadows they had tried to trap me in. And in that moment, I knew I had finally stepped out for good. After the wedding, I did not go home to answer their calls or sit in my apartment replaying the night. Instead, I booked myself a few days away at a quiet resort, a place where I could hear myself think. I packed a small bag, turned my phone to silent, and let the road carry me far enough that the noise of my family felt like it belonged to another world. When I arrived, I walked through the lobby, in silence, noticing how no one there knew me. No one had expectations of who I should be. That alone felt like freedom. The room was simple, clean, with a wide window that opened to a view of the garden. I set my things down and sat at the desk, pulling out my journal. For years, I had filled pages with words that begged for recognition, Words that tried to convince myself I was fine when I wasn't. But this time, the words flowed differently. I wrote, "For the first time, I don't need anyone's praise to know I'm enough." I paused after I wrote it, staring at the line. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like I was pretending. It felt true. I underlined it once, then leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that truth settle inside me. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom. The soft light reflected my face, but as I looked, I imagined a younger girl staring back. She was 10 years old, with round cheeks, shy eyes, and a quiet hope that maybe one day someone would see her. I whispered to her, "You've always been good enough, and now you have me to protect you." My throat tightened as I said it, because I realised I was speaking to the part of me that had been waiting for decades. That little girl had spent nights crying into her pillow, had endured years of silence, had felt like love was something given only to others. I reached out, touching the mirror gently, as though I could reach through and hold her hand. I said again, "You are safe now. You don't have to prove yourself anymore. I will not let anyone treat you the way they did." And for the first time I believed it. A heaviness I had carried for so long seemed to lift. I turned away from the mirror and sat on the bed, letting the quiet fill the room. The past had left scars, but now I knew I was not bound to them. I did not need my family's apologies. I did not need their praise. I did not need their permission. What I needed, I already had. I had me. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling across the room. I made coffee, opened the window, and let the air in. I picked up my phone, saw the long list of missed calls and messages, and instead of opening them, I blocked the numbers. It was not anger, it was peace. I did not need to read another word that would try to twist me back into a shadow. I placed the phone face down and walked outside into the garden. The air smelled of flowers and fresh grass, the kind of simple beauty I had never taken time to notice. I sat on a bench, closed my eyes, and let myself just be. No weight of expectation, no fear of judgment, just me breathing, existing, and knowing that was enough. Later that day, I returned to my journal. I wrote about the little girl in the mirror, about the promises I made to her, about the way my heart had steadied when I spoke those words. I wrote, "They don't define me anymore. I define me, and I choose peace." I closed the journal, pressed my palm to its cover, and felt a sense of calm I had been chasing my whole life. Healing was not loud. It was not a sudden victory. It was these quiet moments where I could see myself clearly and know I was whole. As the sun set, I walked back to my room, the garden fading into shadows, and I smiled. This was not the end of my story, but it was the beginning of one I had written myself. When I woke up the next morning at the resort, I felt as if my whole body had been unchained. For the first time in my life, I opened my eyes without the weight of dread pressing on my chest. The air was fresh, the curtains letting golden light, and I sat there on the edge of the bed, realising I did not have to brace myself for a cutting comment or prepare myself to defend who I was. I stretched, took a deep breath, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm free." It sounded almost strange, but also true. I decided that morning that I would give myself everything I had always been denied: joy, without guilt, rest, without apology, and peace, without someone else's permission. I walked down to the spa, where warm hands eased years of tension from my back and shoulders. Each knot that released felt like a piece of history I no longer had to carry. Later, I wandered through the gardens, letting my hands brush against leaves and flowers, listening to the steady sound of water from a small fountain. For once, I was not rushing, not shrinking, not hiding. I was simply present, and I realised how starved I had been for moments like this. I ate slowly that afternoon, savouring each bite of food, as though it was the first real meal I had ever tasted. I let myself enjoy dessert, not as a reward for suffering, not as a guilty indulgence, but simply because I wanted it. Around me, strangers laughed, couples leaned close, families clinked glasses, and none of them knew me or carried expectations for who I should be. That was the gift. I was free to be myself without judgment. When I returned to my room, My phone sat on the table flashing with messages. Dozens of them. Calls, voicemails, texts. I didn't even need to read them to know what they said. I could almost hear my mother's sharp voice demanding I come back. My father's uneasy tone asking me to make peace. Madison's spiteful words painting herself as the victim once again. For so many years, I would have picked up, instantly desperate not to be cast as the ungrateful daughter, desperate to calm their anger. But not this time. I stared at the screen, then slowly, deliberately, I pressed block. One by one, I cut off their access. It was not out of rage, but out of peace. I wanted to create silence in my life where their voices could no longer reach. And when the buzzing stopped, when the phone finally went quiet, I felt the purest calm settle over me. I took out my journal, the one I had filled with years of desperate words pages, where I begged myself to stay strong, where I convinced myself to endure. But now the words came differently. My hand was steady as I wrote, "For the first time, I don't need anyone's praise to know I'm enough." I set the pen down, reread the line, and felt it echo inside me. This wasn't a line I wrote to comfort myself. It was a truth I finally believed. That evening, I walked into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. I looked at the woman staring back at me, calm, steady, and stronger than she had ever been. And then I let myself imagine the little girl who had once stood in that reflection too, a 10-year-old with shy eyes carrying hope that maybe one day she would feel loved. I whispered to her, "You've always been good enough, and now you have me to protect you." The words caught in my throat, but I didn't turn away. For the first time, I felt as though the gap between who I had been and who I had become was closing. That little girl no longer had to wait. She had me now, and I would never abandon her. As I said those words, tears came, but they were not bitter. They were warm, releasing, like the weight of years leaving me all at once. I reached out and touched the glass as though I could hold her hand through time and promised, "You're safe now. You don't have to prove yourself anymore." I turned away from the mirror lighter than I had ever been. The next morning, the sun rose soft and golden through the window. I made coffee, opened the balcony doors, and breathed in the air. For the first time, the silence was not lonely. It was mine. I sat with my journal again and wrote, "They don't define me anymore. I define me. And I choose peace." I closed the cover, pressed my palm against it, and felt a stillness deep inside me. Healing, I realized, wasn't a dramatic finish or a loud triumph. It was this being able to sit in quiet, feel whole, and know I was free. I thought of Sarah, my trainer who had encouraged me when I stumbled and reminded me that change was possible. I thought of Olivia, who had asked me the question no one else dared, and in doing so gave me the chance to voice my truth. I thought of strangers I had met who smiled at me with kindness, showing me that love and respect were not rare gifts, but natural things people give when they see another human being. And I thought of my family, who had taken and taken until I was empty, who had pushed me into the shadows because they feared my light. I realized I did not hate them anymore. They were simply no longer mine to answer to. A real family doesn't make you afraid. A real family makes you feel safe, and I deserve that. That afternoon, I walked outside into the garden. The sky was painted with soft streaks of orange and gold, the air warm against my skin. I closed my eyes, tilted my face toward the sun, and smiled, not because anyone told me I could, not because anyone finally praised me, but because I had chosen myself, and I knew in my heart that I was enough. The truth was simple, and I carried it with me like a vow. Happiness doesn't need anyone's approval. It doesn't need permission, negotiation, or proof. Happiness is mine the moment I accept it, the moment I protect it, the moment I choose it. And from now on, I will. I deserve that. And nothing they say, nothing they do, will ever take it away from me again. If you are still listening, I want to pause here because maybe something in my story reminds you of your own. Maybe you too have been pushed into the shadows, made to feel small, or told that you had to earn love. If that is true, then hear me clearly now. You are already enough. You do not need to prove your worth to anyone who cannot see it. The people who try to dim your light are often only afraid of how brightly you can shine. Healing is not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it is possible. Some people find it in journaling, pouring out the words they never got to say. Some find it in therapy, finally having a safe place where they are heard. Others find it in simple acts, taking long walks, practicing mindfulness, surrounding themselves with friends who lift them up instead of pulling them down. What matters most is choosing yourself, even in small ways, every single day. And if today you feel like you are still carrying too much pain, remember that you do not have to carry it alone. There are safe people, safe spaces, and safe practices that can help you. What happened to you does not define you. What you choose to do with your life from here forward, that is your truth. So as I close my story, I leave you with this: happiness does not need anyone's permission. Real family, whether by blood or chosen, will never make you afraid. It will make you feel safe, valued, and loved. And you deserve that, just as I finally realized I did. Thank you for being here, for walking through this story with me. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of struggle, of strength, and of finding your way forward, I invite you to stay connected with this channel. Subscribe if you wish, so that when the next story is shared, you'll be here to listen. Not because you have to, but because sometimes hearing another voice can remind you that you are not alone. And you are not alone. Not now, not ever.